Mr. Johnson the panda lives in fluffy gardens. Mr. Johnson lives here, at 4 Bamboo Grove to be precise. Mr. Johnson, like many pandas, likes to lounge around and enjoy the calm of a sunny afternoon. And like many pandas, Mr. Johnson likes to eat bamboo shoots. Most of all, Mr. Johnson loves gardening. Nothing makes Mr. Johnson happier than taking care of his flowers. Mr. Johnson's garden is his favorite thing in the whole wide world. But Mr. Johnson loves his flowers so much that he will not let anybody near them. He is afraid that someone could ruin his beautiful garden. He thinks that someone might tread on his daisies, trample his dandelions, and even twist his buttercups. In fact, if he saw you looking at his garden now, he would scream in fright and shout, "Ah, please, get away from my flowers!" Silly Mr. Johnson. Our story begins one morning in Bamboo Grove. Mr. Johnson was sitting down to breakfast. He wore a big smile on his face because today he was having his favorite breakfast. A huge plate of bamboo shoots with marmalade and a nice cup of tea. Mr. Johnson looked out the window to admire his beautiful garden. He thought to himself, "My favorite thing in the whole wide world is my garden." Just then, Mr. Johnson noticed the little penguin postman walking up his garden path. Mr. Johnson suddenly thought that the penguin postman might tread on his daisies. He jumped up and ran to the window. "Ah!" he shouted very loudly. "Please, get away from my flowers!" Dropping his sack of letters, the startled penguin ran off down the road. He was very frightened indeed by Mr. Johnson's shouting. When Mr. Johnson saw how frightened the little penguin was, he felt bad about shouting so loudly. Later that day, Mr. Johnson was out in his garden. He carried a large green watering can and wore a pair of bright yellow Wellington boots. Flowers can get very thirsty, so Mr. Johnson was making sure they all had plenty to drink. Mr. Johnson noticed Colleen the cow walking to his house, carefully holding a little cup. "Mr. Johnson might be able to lend me some sugar," thought Colleen. She had run out and the shop was closed today. Mr. Johnson suddenly thought that Colleen the cow might trample his dandelions. He jumped up, ran to his gate and shouted very loudly, "Ah, please, get away from my flowers!" Colleen dropped the cup and ran off down the road. When Mr. Johnson saw how frightened Colleen was, he felt very bad about shouting so loudly. That afternoon, Mr. Johnson was arranging some of his favorite flowers. He liked to put all of the yellow flowers together. Don't they look pretty? Wee Reg the puppy walked up to the house wagging his little tail. "Mr. Johnson might be able to help me fix my broken lawnmower," thought Wee Reg. Mr. Johnson suddenly thought that Wee Reg the puppy might twist his buttercups. He jumped up, ran to his window and shouted very loudly, "Ah, please, get away from my flowers!" Wee Reg dropped his broken lawnmower and ran off down the road. When Mr. Johnson saw how frightened Wee Reg was, he felt very bad about shouting so loudly. Nobody else came to visit Mr. Johnson that day. Everyone was afraid that Mr. Johnson might shout at them. He was feeling very lonely and felt very bad about upsetting his friends. So bad, in fact, that he came up with a plan to make things better. First, Mr. Johnson gathered up the penguin postman's letters and delivered all of the letters himself. He gave the little sack to the penguin postman. "I'm very sorry I shouted at you," said Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson glued the pieces of Colleen the cow's cup back together. When the glue had dried, he filled the cup with sugar and toddled off to Colleen's house. "I'm very sorry I shouted at you," said Mr. Johnson. Then Mr. Johnson put together all of the pieces of Wee Reg's lawnmower. He fixed it up as good as new and even surprised Wee Reg by mowing his lawn. "I'm very sorry I shouted at you," said Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson did one more thing that evening, something that you would never expect Mr. Johnson to do. He invited everyone around for a garden party, so that everyone could enjoy his daisies, dandelions, and even his buttercups. Everyone came to the party and had a great time. Of course, they all forgave him for shouting, and they each brought a new flower for Mr. Johnson's garden. So now, as well as daisies, dandelions, and buttercups, Mr. Johnson's garden is filled with roses, tulips, lilies, and many other colourful flowers. But even with this beautiful garden, Mr. Johnson has a new favourite thing in all the world. These days, Mr. Johnson looks out into his garden and thinks to himself, "My favourite thing in the whole wide world is sharing my garden with all my friends."